They say secrets have a way of crushing you from the inside. For me, it wasn't just the weight of the secret. It was the silence that came with it. That suffocating, endless silence. Since that day, I've carried something so heavy it felt like it was breaking me apart. That moment didn't just shatter my trust. It broke everything I thought I knew about love, family, and safety. Let me take you back. Back to where it all began. To the day my world shifted, and I realized the people closest to you can hurt you the deepest. This is my story. I was 17 when my mom, Sarah Mitchell, remarried. It wasn't exactly a surprise. She'd been working herself to exhaustion for years after my dad left. Double shifts at Memorial Hospital, overtime whenever they offered it. Anything to keep our little world from falling apart. But when she met James Cooper, something changed. She started smiling more. Really smiling, not the tired kind she'd wear after 12-hour shifts. She laughed more too, the kind that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. She looked lighter, like the weight she'd carried for so long had finally lifted. James seemed perfect. He was charming in that effortless way that made people lean in when he talked. He'd bring my mom coffee during her night shifts. Massage her shoulders when she came home exhausted. Remind her to take breaks she never gave herself permission to take. At first, I thought he was too good to be true. Maybe he was. Looking back, I ignored so many things. I ignored the way his compliments lingered just a second too long. I ignored the fleeting glances that made my stomach twist. I convinced myself they didn't mean anything. And I ignored the way he'd sometimes say things that felt off. Like calling me beautiful in a way that wasn't just polite. But something else entirely. I told myself it was nothing. He was my mom's savior, wasn't he? My mom trusted him completely. She needed him to be the man she thought he was. And I needed her to be happy. So I went along with it. James knew how to win people over. He had this charm that wrapped around you before you even realized what was happening. He'd tell stories about his childhood, always a little self-deprecating. Like he wanted you to know he wasn't perfect either. But perfect wasn't the word for James. Perfect hides too much. As for me, I was just trying to figure myself out. 17 isn't an easy age. Especially when you're used to being invisible. My mom loved me, I never doubted that. But she was always working late. Running on fumes and trying to keep us afloat. I felt like an afterthought sometimes. And maybe that wasn't fair, she was doing her best. Still, it left a hole that I didn't know how to fill. That's where James came in. At first, he just seemed interested. He'd ask about my AP classes. Listen to me ramble about my dreams of becoming a writer. Help me with things like fixing my ancient laptop when it crashed. It felt nice to have someone notice me. Even if it wasn't my mom. But now I wonder if that's what he wanted. To make me feel seen. To make me trust him. And I did. At least at first. Mom's shifts at the hospital kept getting longer. She was barely home anymore. Most nights she'd stumble through the door after midnight. Exhausted, mumbling something about patient rounds before crashing in bed. At first, James would make light of it. She's married to her job, he'd joke. Laughing in that way that almost felt real. But it wasn't funny. Not really. I started noticing the way his smile would fade when she wasn't looking. The way he'd sigh when she called to say she'd be late again. It was subtle, but it was there. I thought he just missed her. Now I wonder if it was something else entirely. In her absence, James started stepping in more. At first, it felt harmless. He'd cook dinner, ask about my day. Even help me with my calculus homework. It was nice, actually, to have someone who seemed to care. I didn't realize how much I'd missed that. One evening, I was struggling with a history essay. James sat down beside me with a cup of hot chocolate. "Let's tackle it together," he said. And we did. He made it seem so easy, breaking it down into parts one could manage. When I handed it in the next day, I got an A. James smiled like he was proud of me. And for once, I felt like I wasn't just fumbling through life on my own. It wasn't just homework, though. James started noticing things. Little things. He'd ask about my friends, my favorite music, even how I was feeling. It was more attention than I'd gotten from anyone in a long time. And I didn't know how to handle it. I started looking forward to our talks. To the way he'd listen like I actually mattered. I didn't think much of it then. I thought he was just being kind. But kindness can feel like a trap when it comes with strings. I remember the first time I felt uneasy around James. It was a Saturday morning, and I was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through Instagram, not really paying attention. He walked in, ruffled my hair, and said, "You're really growing into a beautiful young woman." I laughed it off because what else was I supposed to do? But the words clung to me, sticky and uncomfortable. Something about the way he said it didn't feel right. I told myself I was overthinking it. James was just being nice, wasn't he? Except it kept happening. Not often, but enough to notice. A lingering glance here. A comment that felt too personal there. And yet I didn't say anything. I didn't even know how to. Mom adored James. And I didn't want to ruin that. So I stayed quiet. I convinced myself I was imagining it. Even though deep down, I knew I wasn't. Looking back, it's easy to see how I fell into the pattern. James made me feel like I mattered in a way no one else had. But with every kind word, ever. Why thoughtful gesture? There was something else beneath it. Something I couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore either. And the closer he got, the harder it was to pull away. The days started blending together. Each one a careful dance of avoidance and pretense. I'd wake up early to avoid breakfast with him. Stay late at school, buried in extracurriculars. Anything to minimize the time we spent alone. But James was patient. He knew exactly how to play the long game. How to make each interaction seem innocent. Each gesture just caring enough to pass as fatherly. If anyone had been watching, they wouldn't have seen anything wrong. That's what scared me the most. How normal it all looked from the outside. How easily he could make everything seem fine. When really, nothing was fine at all. I started losing sleep. Jumping at small sounds. Checking twice, 3 times, that my bedroom door was locked at night. My best friend, Ashley, noticed something was off. "You seem different," she said one day at lunch. I just shrugged and blamed it on college application stress. Another lie to add to the growing pile. But what could I say? That my stepfather's attention made my skin crawl? That I was afraid to be in my own home? That I didn't know if I was crazy or if something was really wrong? The words felt impossible to speak. So I swallowed them down. Let them join the knot of anxiety in my stomach. And tried to keep swimming in waters that felt deeper every day. One morning, everything changed. The rain was tapping lightly against the windows. like nature itself was trying to warn me. Mom had left before dawn for a 3-day medical conference. Her suitcase clattering down the stairs as James helped her load the car. The house felt too quiet after she left. The kind of quiet that wraps around you and pulls you inward. James offered to make breakfast. He cracked eggs into a pan, humming to some old song on the radio. I sat at the table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea. And for the first time in weeks, it felt almost normal. He asked me about my classes, my friends, even my favorite books. We talked about everything and nothing. And it felt good. I felt seen. Not like an afterthought or a burden, but like I mattered. I didn't realize how much I missed that feeling until it was right in front of me. But then something shifted. Later that morning, I decided to take a shower. The hot water always helped me clear my head. I could let the steam fill the room and pretend, just for a moment, that everything outside didn't matter. I was rinsing shampoo from my hair when I heard it. The faint creak of the bathroom door opening. My heart jolted. At first, I thought it was Mom. Maybe coming back because she'd forgotten something. But then I remembered she wasn't home. My breath caught and I froze. Water streaming down my face. The sound of footsteps was soft, but unmistakable. Then I heard his voice. "Hey," James said, his tone light, almost casual. I just needed to grab a towel. I clutched the shower curtain like it was armor. The fabric stuck to my wet hands. My heart pounded so loudly I could hardly hear anything else. James didn't move right away. He stood there, smiling. His eyes lingering far too long. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. But I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I felt small and helpless. Like a deer frozen in headlights. And then, just as quickly as he came, he left. The door clicked shut behind him. And I was alone again. But the air felt heavy. Like the walls themselves had shifted. I stayed in the shower far longer than I needed to, letting the water turn cold. As I replayed the moment over and over in my mind. Was it an accident? Did I overreact? 1,000 questions filled my head. But no answers came. Just fear. Just confusion. When I finally stepped out of the shower, I felt like a different person. Like something had been taken from me. Even though I couldn't quite name what it was. I tried to shake it off. To push the feeling aside. But it stayed with me. Clinging like the steam on the mirror. That refused to fade. For days, that moment in the shower haunted me. I replayed it again and again. Trying to make sense of it. Did I overreact? Maybe he really just needed a towel. But then why didn't he knock? Why did he linger? And why did I feel so exposed? My mind wouldn't stop twisting itself into knots. The more I thought about it, the worse it got. But no matter how much I wanted to push it away, the feeling stayed. A knot in my stomach that wouldn't loosen. I couldn't tell Mom. She'd been through so much already. James made her happy. And I didn't want to be the one to take that away. But every time I saw him, I felt like a stranger in my own skin. He acted like nothing had happened. Like everything was fine. And maybe that's what scared me the most. That it was so easy for him to pretend. That maybe to him, it wasn't a big deal at all. James's behavior started to shift. Little by little. He'd ask where I was going, who I was with. Like he cared. But it didn't feel like concern. It felt like control. When I got home late from study group, his tone was sharp, almost accusing. "You shouldn't be out so late," he'd say. His eyes narrowing just enough to make me feel like I'd done something wrong. But around Mom, he was perfect. Charming. Thoughtful. The kind of man who'd light candles for dinner and kiss her on the forehead just to make her smile. It was like watching someone flip a switch. And every time he laughed at her jokes or held her hand, I felt like I was losing my mind. I started pulling away. Not just from him, but from everything. My friends noticed. But I didn't know how to explain it. How do you tell someone that your home doesn't feel safe anymore? That the person who's said to protect you makes you want to disappear? The walls seemed to close in a little more each day. And I was running out of places to hide. One night, everything unraveled. I was in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when James's phone buzzed on the counter. He was outside smoking on the porch. And for a second, I thought about ignoring it. But something made me look. The screen lit up with a text. "Miss you already." My heart stopped. My hands shook as I picked up the phone. I shouldn't have looked. But I couldn't stop myself. There were dozens of messages. All from the same number. Flirty. Intimate. Pictures. My throat tightened. And my chest felt like it was caving in. He wasn't just cheating on Mom. He was lying to all of us. And suddenly everything clicked. The lingering looks. The comments. The way he acted like he owned me in this house. It was all part of the same pattern. And I hated him for it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to march outside. Throw his phone at him. And tell him I knew everything. But I didn't. I couldn't. The words stuck in my throat. Heavy and suffocating. If I told Mom, it would destroy her. If I stayed silent, it would destroy me. I felt trapped. Like I was drowning in secrets I didn't ask to keep. That night, I barely slept. The evidence on his phone played on repeat in my mind. Like a horror movie I couldn't turn off. I thought about Mom. Working those endless hospital shifts. Believing she'd finally found happiness. While James made a mockery of everything. The next morning, I watched them at breakfast. Mom sipping her coffee. James kissing her goodbye. The perfect picture of domestic bliss. It made me sick. I spent the next few days in a fog. Going through the motions. Pretending everything was normal. While carrying this crushing weight. James must have sensed something was different. He watched me more closely. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Like a predator sensing danger. I started documenting everything. Taking screenshots of his texts when I could. Writing down every inappropriate comment. Every uncomfortable moment. Building my case. Because I knew. When I finally spoke up. I'd need proof. I couldn't just have my word against his. One evening, after a particularly long shift. Mom came home early. James wasn't back yet. And I knew. This was my chance. My hands were trembling. As I sat her down at the kitchen table. "Mom," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "There's something I need to tell you." She looked at me with tired eyes. still in her nurse's scrubs. And I almost lost my nerve. But I couldn't carry it anymore. The weight of it all. The shower. The texts. The lies. It was suffocating me. So I told her everything. Each word felt like glass in my throat. But I forced them out. I showed her the screenshots I'd taken. The messages I'd documented. Every piece of evidence I'd gather. Ed. She didn't say anything at first. Just stared at the phone in her hands. Her face growing paler with each scroll. "Are you sure, Emma?" she finally whispered. Her voice shaking. I nodded. I was sure. I had the proof. And then she started to cry. Not soft tears. But the kind that rack your whole body. Leaving you gasping for air. I wanted to hold her. To tell her it would be okay. But I didn't know if it would be. Not yet. We sat there in the kitchen. The clock ticking on the wall. Until we heard his car in the driveway. Mom straightened up. Wiped her eyes. And something in her changed. I saw steel enter her spine. The same strength that got her through night shifts. And raising me alone. When James walked in. Smiling that perfect smile. He froze. Seeing us both at the table. Seeing his phone between us. And his mask slipped. Just for a second. But we both saw it. The truth beneath the charm. What happened next is a blur. Mom's voice, steady and cold. James's excuses, falling flat. The sound of something shattering. Maybe a glass. Maybe our illusions. She told him to get out. To pack his things and leave. He tried to argue. To charm his way out. Like he always did. But Mom wasn't having it. "Get out," she said again. "Or I call the police." I watched from my window. As he loaded his car in the dark. He didn't look back once. And just like that. He was gone. The house felt different that night. Emptier. But cleaner somehow. Like we'd lanced a wound. And could finally start to heal. Mom and I sat on the couch until dawn. Talking. Crying. Holding each other. Starting to rebuild. It's been years since that night. Since I found the courage to speak up. Some scars don't fade. They linger. Showing up in quiet moments. When you least expect them. But I've learned something important. Secrets don't protect you. They trap you. Wrapping tighter and tighter. Until you can't breathe. Speaking my truth was the hardest thing I've ever done. But it set me free. And that freedom. It's worth everything. Mom and I are closer now. Than we've ever been. She's cut back on her hours at the hospital. Started taking care of herself more. We have weekly movie nights. Just the two of us. And slowly. Day by day. We're building something new. Something stronger. Something true. Because that's the thing about truth. It might hurt at first. But it's the only thing. That really sets you free. End.